Okay, so why don't we get started now? Welcome all of you on the Zoom call. This is going to be the inaugural session for the AIA East Bay Architects Community on the Environment for 2024. We have two speakers who are going to be talking about an exciting project in Sunnyvale. Graham Lynn is the president of HabLab, which is a building performance consulting firm that he founded in 2021. And before that, he had almost 10 years or more than 10 years of experience in building performance. Also, Bianca Hunter with Huntner. So I'm sorry, excuse me for that. With Bluepoint Planning, she's worked on regional and state energy planning, climate action and adaptation, and equitable community outreach and engagement. The two of them are going to be talking about a 1,200 acre eco innovation district that will house 40,000 people and will be developed in the most climate friendly way possible. And to put all that together, I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. So which of you will go first? I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Yeah,
Bianca's first.
I will go ahead and share here. Give me a minute.
Oh, I'm going to say one more thing at the end. Their presentation will be about an hour, and there will be time for questions. But along the way, you can put questions in the chat, and I will be posing those at the end. So either way, there will be time for filling in the blanks. So
Great. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, as you probably saw from the event description, we're going to talk about the Moffett Park redevelopment in Sunnyvale, California. And this is just what I'll be covering today. So first I'll talk provide a little more background on Moffett Park and the development, as well as our role and Graham's role in the project. I'll provide an overview of general, just getting us on the same page around what energy infrastructure even means, and then talk a little bit about the benefits of district scale energy. And that's when Graham will pick it up and go into the modeling side of the district scale energy piece. So as Ned mentioned, Moffett Park is a 1,200 acre redevelopment site in Sunnyvale, California. It is currently an office park. All the little white squares here are offices, and the vast amount of dark gray are huge parking lots. So we're looking at a very sort of traditional office park landscape here. And we're looking to transform it into a mixed-use neighborhood with over 40,000 residents. So kind of a big change from what it is today. And that's going to include, and I should mention also that there is a specific plan that was recently passed by Sunnyvale. And the specific plan was triggered in large part because of Google's planned development in the area. And there is some questions around what that's going to look like, because there was recently a pause in an agreement between Google and its sort of leasing and construction company, but there's still going to be significant development here, and there's going to be additional office, additional residential, mixed use commercial, and all of the fabric that ties together those elements. So I just wanted to provide a brief image here of, it's a little bit old, it's from 2013, but America's infrastructure grades that it gets. So we have across energy, public parks and recreation and roads. There's a lot of really poor aging infrastructure that is needed, that will need to be replaced. And Moffett Park is not an exception. It was sort of highly developed in sort of like 30s, 40s era. And so there's a lot of its roads, again, its energy infrastructure really needs an upgrade. And so this redevelopment plan is a huge opportunity to sort of do an overhaul and reimagine what the infrastructure could look like. And here I mentioned a large part of, again, the trigger of the specific plan was Google's development in the area. You can see they own a lot of land here, as well as some other other major landowners that are listed in that key above. And then this is the planned land use map from the specific plan. So as I mentioned, in blue, we have a lot of more additional office space being added in. We have those kind of higher density activity centers. We have mixed use commercial. And then in yellow, we have a lot of residential buildings. So again, really changing the fabric of what Moffett Park looks like today. And this is a vision from the specific plan for Moffett Park. So Moffett Park is an integral part of Sunnyvale and is a well-connected ecological innovation district with a diverse mix of uses that serves as a model of resilience, climate protection, equity, and economic opportunity. So a really sort of bold and different vision, and I'll be going into those pieces later. And I also wanted to touch on the specific plan versus what Bluepoint was tasked to do, and is currently working on, the infrastructure strategy. So the specific plan really covers the what of Moffett Park. So it talks around goals for the area. It touches on high-level planning, provides standards for land use, open space and urban ecology, and mobility within the district. And then infrastructure strategy, which is Bluepoint's role in the project, is more dealing with the how. So how is this actually going to happen? So we cover enabling mechanisms, funding strategies, operations and ownership to help develop and implement infrastructure for those categories I mentioned above. And these are the 4 goals of the infrastructure strategy that we've laid out. So again, going back to the vision, we want of climate and eco-innovation, and a lot of that having to do with reducing emissions, as well as providing resilient, things like resilient landscaping for flooding. We want to make sure that that's translated into the actual implementation and development of Moffett Park. We want to optimize district scale approaches when appropriate, effective, and in line with the specific plan. And that's something that I will go into in a couple slides as well, because that relates to the energy piece. We want to advance a sense of place, equity, and community benefits. And we also want to support efficient and effective management, funding, and operations to make sure that the infrastructure functions as intended as Moffett Park is built out in the coming decades. And I wanted to highlight here some really kind of foundational district infrastructure elements that we are considering in our plan. So we talk about recycled water, so gray and black water, supporting robust alternative mobility, supporting green infrastructure. And with these sorts of things, when we think about it at a district scale, we start to see advantages that might not be present on a site-by-site level. So for things like green infrastructure, how can we think about benefits that can sort of compound when we think about synergies across multiple sites, similar to networks of park and open space? We're also talking around smart communications and developing, for example, high-speed fiber across the district. We have community amenities, renewable energy. Again, that's a huge piece, and that's a lot of what we're talking about today, and to a lesser extent, waste management as well. And as I sort of mentioned, at a district scale, when we think about these systems, we really see there's a large opportunity for interplay within multiple of these systems. So when we think about things like underpinning communications infrastructure, that also relates to district scale energy, being able to manage different energy loads. When we think about parks and designing parks, we can also think about how mobility and alternative transit like pedestrian and bike access and trails are supported through park systems. So really all this to say that when we think about this as an opportunity for development, there's a lot of interconnected benefits that we can leverage when we work at this scale. So now I want to go back to the second goal that I mentioned of the infrastructure strategy that we're working on, which is to optimize district scale approaches when appropriate, effective, and in line with the specific plan. So we want to be able to maximize benefits for cost and management of the district, maximizing multimodal connectivity, as I mentioned, ensuring that parks and open space are equitably located and also publicly accessible. So not just limited to a specific office or a specific residential complex. We want to, as I also touched on, implement district-wide connected green stormwater infrastructure while integrating gray water and black water recycling. We want to explore opportunities to provide district-wide high-speed fiber and technology infrastructure, and identify pathways to enable clean and renewable energy systems. So, yeah, a lot of, as Ned mentioned at the beginning, it's like, how do we do this? And I should just say that this sort of development, it's really hard. It's been a fun challenge for us, but it's been hard to sort of refer back to any guidance because there's not necessarily guidance for something at this scale. So a lot of, we're figuring things out as we go along, but in terms of implementing and achieving that eco-innovation district, we have some elements that we're covering that we made sure we're both in the specific plan and that we're covering in the infrastructure strategy. So we have the funding piece, which is really critical. Some of the specific plan, deals with development requirements and community benefits. So ensuring that is equitable and is really funding what needs to be funded. We also have the upfront capital for projects that don't fall within the sort of site development, and ongoing operations and maintenance funding as well. So we're addressing that. We also are talking about roles. So who is going to ensure that who's going to maintain, manage, and operate this infrastructure over the continued lifetime of this area? And we're thinking through the, roles including city operated, including in some cases, potential for, when it comes to district scale energy, more third party, whether that's a community choice aggregator or another, utility. And also what, a group that we're calling a special purpose entity, which is essentially a smaller governing body that could help with development and allocation of funds in Moffett Park. So we really, a lot of the infrastructure strategy focuses on who's going to be doing what, who's responsible for what. We also have the policy side. So I mentioned also district standards, making sure progressive district standards are in the specific plan. And also something we talked about was sort of piloting innovation. So being able to use Moffett Park as a sort of testing ground for some of these policies and practices that might not necessarily be current practice in the rest of Sunnyvale, but how can we take these and expand it in the future and understand, when we find something that works, how can we scale it for the rest of Sunnyvale? And then also we're touching on phasing, which is a huge question, and we're still in conversation around that, but thinking around trigger points, what triggers certain infrastructure development, what's the timing of it, what incentives are there for development. So now I'm gonna give sort of a brief overview on the energy infrastructure side of things, just so we know what we mean by energy infrastructure. So here, it's the broad definition is all infrastructure providing or distributing power throughout the district. So when we first set out in this planning process, we had a lot, we wanted to consider the broadest sort of infrastructure possible. So to us, that included, the consideration of a microgrid, a self-sufficient energy system. It's powered through, energy sources such as solar that can operate separately from the energy grid, an ambient loop heating and cooling system. And Graham is going to go a little bit more in depth on that in his presentation, but essentially uses water and transfers water throughout heat pumps within a given network. We have waste heat recovery systems, also, thinking about a large, these large players like Google, thinking about data center heat recovery as well. We have mobile battery systems, which are large-scale batteries that can be sort of moved around and deployed to provide additional energy to the grid. Going back to the technology side of that technology piece, we also have fiber optic communications and smart grid technology that is going to enable energy systems to communicate with each other and form that sort of grid stability. We have transmission lines, we have electric vehicle charging, we have solar as well in all of its forms, rooftop solar, potentially a community scale solar, freestanding solar, and solar generation on parking lots as well. So energy infrastructure is this huge piece here. So now I just want to go into some of the benefits of district scale energy. I just want to paint a little picture and sort of this trajectory that we're on towards zero emissions resilient districts, and the sort of shift in how we conceptualize the role of building energy use. So, I think 20 or so years ago, the landscape of building energy use looked very different. We were really focused on energy efficient buildings. And to some extent, that's also still happening today, but the focus was on changing out appliances, really good insulation. So to reduce, knowing that we would be emitting carbon, right, that we had emissions from buildings, but we were trying to lower it. Then we have this idea of zero net energy buildings. So buildings that produce as much energy as they consume, like, for example, over the course of a year. So buildings we're still using, let's say, natural gas, but they would also be producing and going back to the grid things like solar, ultimately more or less, leveling out and zeroing out that energy use. Then we're moving to zero emissions buildings, and I think there's still a lot of talk. There is a lot of talk around decarbonization, getting off of natural gas, installing solar and other distributed energy resources. So instead of just leveling out energy use, we're actually eliminating it completely. And then this sort of, I think where we are now, moving towards it at least, is this idea of not only zero emissions, but resilient communities and districts. And as we, I think, grapple with a lot of challenges in California, related to weather, power shutoffs, those sorts of things, we are understanding the increased importance of not only the zero emission side of things, but being able to operate have a resilient grid that can function and keep us safe in those sorts of disasters. So again, as I mentioned here, just zero net energy buildings, produce as much energy as they consume over the course of the year, building off of the high levels of energy efficiency. It also may employ techniques like management, through like smart thermostats. So managing users' energy demands and then having those renewables as well. And then moving towards decarbonization, switching off gas appliances, putting in all electric appliances, coupled with things like solar and battery storage. And then again, as I mentioned, that resilience piece, as we're really seeing, even just within the last 5 or so years, how much of our energy grid is really impacted in the case of an emergency, and how can we better prepare ourselves for those emergencies. And also, I should say I have a rambunctious little kitten right here, so she may cause some trouble, but hopefully not too much. So this here is to say that there's benefits, that a building by building approach is not always enough. A building by building approach may not include the outside of the building and think holistically when it comes to things like site placement or tree shading, how we can reduce energy use in this broader context where the building lies. It doesn't leverage larger scale infrastructure projects. It also doesn't take into account that not every building can necessarily be, zero net energy or zero emissions. We might have a historic site that cannot be significantly altered. That building itself may not be able to be zero emissions. But if we think about it at a district scale, then some of the opportunities come into play. And then also the economic side of things as well. We get economies of scale when we work at that district scale too. And so sometimes at a building by building basis, zero energy may not be economically feasible. And there's a variety of, sort of usage types or where a district might be useful. We see them sometimes in downtown commercial areas. We also see them often on educational, like college campuses, or on larger scale residential developments as well. And those two areas have the advantage of having a single property owner, making some of the sort of structure or technical and structural questions around how ownership and management easier than, let's say, a major new development like Moffett Park, which has a lot of questions around that, and which is something that we are currently grappling with as well. But yeah, that's it for now. That's sort of a broad overview, and I will stop there and turn it over to Graham, and I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions on this very complex project at the end of the presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bianca. You know, I just I'm super awed by this project, you know, when hope you all uh, felt the magnitude of what we're talking about here, this gigantic piece of Sunnyvale. And when this opportunity first came in front of me, I was just like, this is amazing. Like I don't know, maybe in Europe they've done something kind of this ambitious, or at least they have historical energy systems like this, but it was just such an incredible idea. And so I was really excited to join. And a lot of what I do is, yeah, working building by building, lots of energy studies, fresh air studies, commissioning, things like that. But like working at this huge scale, I was like, well, I think I know what to do. But Bianca said it well. Like we we sort of a little bit had to figure it out as we're going along. So that's a lot of what happening here in my talk, is showing you how we were figuring it out, making assumptions, putting together data. So yeah, the Bianca already articulated the gist of, or the overview of this whole project. I won't belabor that. I will point out go back. The last, I pulled some of these quotes from the specific plan, and there is this district scale infrastructure. That's where we zeroed in, and that's where Bluepoint obviously has a bigger scope. I think, what is it, Meyer and Associates did the specific plan.
Oh, Raimi, yeah.
Bianca?
Sorry, I should
Ramey,
have mentioned that.
sorry, my bad. I apologize if anyone is from that firm on the call. Um, so there's folks doing this enormously top level plan, and then more detail, Bluepoint doing this whole infrastructure piece, talking about all the different important elements. And then from there, it was like, okay, well, we want to do some we want to get some data, like what kind of district system could we do? What does it look like? And just figuring that question out took some time, like talking about like, what would my scope be? Like what's useful? And most of what I'm going to talk about today is this basically like what we call sort of like district thermal energy sharing, but it does fit into microgrid stuff. We'll touch on that at the end. So just to kind of preface it up front, like a lot of the core energy use of buildings is heating and cooling, which is like what we kind of just call thermal energy. So yeah, we started off by saying, okay, what are the questions we need to answer in order to like evaluate, can we do a district system in this neighborhood? And the super highest level, it's like, how much energy is needed for this neighborhood and what kinds? That's the starting point. A traditional energy concept on the left that everyone is familiar with on this call is, you've got a building, and inside it there's a bunch of stuff, appliances and heating and cooling, and they're all running to serve the occupants and keep the building going. And at a very minimum, of course, there'll be electricity coming in, and then depending on the building, maybe there's also some fossil fuel like natural gas to provide heating. But those are like the inputs. Whereas in a district system, um, the most typical way to think about a district system is you're pulling out some stuff from the building. You're pulling out the heating and pulling out the cooling. So the easiest way to think about that is it's hot water or chilled water. So you've still got electricity going into a building, but maybe you're also providing directly hot water to the building, and then inside the building there's a radiator or something. It's a very simple device inside the building. And I bet many of you have worked on campuses, and so you're very familiar with this idea, but I just wanted to highlight this is where we're starting from, trying to understand the electricity, the heating, and the cooling needs of a whole neighborhood. So the starting point is we know what we're trying to look for. Okay, what is the neighborhood? And so we inherited a bunch of planning that had already been done with, I'm sure, an enormous set of stakeholders, and had, it was always sort of like in draft, but it was far enough along that we could use it for our study, and it defines Moffett Park in terms of a bunch of neighborhoods. And Bianca told me the neighborhood names have changed, and I looked on I think they're calling it No Jaw and Soja now instead of North Java, South Java. So if any of you see this plan in the wild, my data on the names is old. But the gist is you have land area on the far left, you have targets for open space on the far right. In between, you have building sort of existing situation and projections. So, existing square footage of stuff in one column, and then projected office, research development, industrial building square footage. And so that's pretty much all new, or probably significantly renovated square footage, but it's a range, right? Like you've got, each one of these neighborhoods, it's defined as a range, which is immediately an important thing for us. Like, we don't even know how big this neighborhood is exactly. We know it's either probably this low end, or it could be as high as the high end. Like, that's immediately an opportunity for having to figure out where does that land us in terms of a district system. And then the residential range, again, it's given in terms of dwelling units, not square footage, but still it's a range, like a low density to high density. So we have these ranges to contend with. And then we have the efficiency of the use of the site. And all of you architects are much more familiar with FAR than I am as sort of the energy engineer consultant. But the gist, of course, is there's sort of a minimum efficiency of the space, FAR, given for all these different land use types. And it's not exactly zoning, but there's land uses, like these blue ones are office space. Then there's orange for mixed use, which I'm sure everyone's works in that all the time. And so, there's these minimums on the far left. But then, in a process that is articulated in the specific plan that I won't even attempt to replicate, you can get more, you can add more stories to your building. You can have a higher FAR number. And so that's another point of uncertainty to contend with. Do we use the minimum number of floor to area ratio, or do we use the maximum? So all this stuff I'm discussing with Bianca, and we're trying to come up with good assumptions. And so where we ended up with is, I'm going to model a whole neighborhood of buildings. I'm going to literally make an energy model of a whole neighborhood of buildings, but there's going to be sort of two categories. There's going to be low energy shape neighborhood and a high energy shape neighborhood. The low energy shape is on the left there. It's very squat. It's small. It's just small. It has less square footage, but it's also squat and close to the ground. There's more roof. A roof is usually more well insulated, so that means it'll use less energy. And then, on below, on the ground is not quite an insulator, but certainly not nearly as much temperature swing as an exterior wall. So you've got a low energy shape, and then on the other side, we have high energy shape. We're build a neighborhood with a bunch of tall buildings with high square footage. You know, it's tall, that uses more energy because it's got exterior wall that's experiencing ambient air. Exterior wall is usually not as well insulated as the roof. And then there's some details about how many people are in the building, and it's that's all laid out in the report. Kind of boring to go through right here, but I want you to all remember that there's the low energy set of buildings and the high energy, because we didn't know, we couldn't assume that they would behave the same in terms of a district system. We wanted to make sure we accounted for sort of the extreme ends of what the plan provides. So a few more assumptions we had to make along the way. First one was, okay, we have office / R&D space. What is that? How much of it is office? And worked with Bianca and Mindy at Bluepoint to try to come up with good projections based on how the rest of the plan is written. We came up with these numbers, mostly office space, some laboratory, and a little bit data center. Now, this is a serious assumption, and if the specific plan changed its goals down the line, then that would necessitate going back and of course redoing something like this study, because these have a big impact on the shape of the energy use in the neighborhood. So let's see. Next assumption is we have to figure out, okay, how many of these existing buildings will be left? And basically, from the way that the plan is written, it's very unlikely that very many existing buildings will stay. I mean, Bianca mentioned, there's some buildings of historic importance, those could stay for sure. But a lot of the buildings will either be replaced or deeply renovated. So we started with that point, and then finally, there's the part that architects do, which is like designing an actual building. What is the shape? What what is the aesthetic of the building? What is the how does it respond to the site? I mean, the whole, that whole scope. Well, what do? I don't just want to design one giant building to fill up the neighborhood, or 20 identically sized buildings. That doesn't seem realistic. So I just made an assumption that the distribution of buildings in a neighborhood would follow some kind of normal, what we call a normal distribution, if any of you recall your statistics. And the gist is most of the buildings will have a similar square footage, kind of near the middle, near the average, and then a few more on the next level out, the next standard deviation, and finally not many on the edge. So you can see that here. I've got the actual computer models of the buildings for one neighborhood, and they don't look very amazing. This doesn't match the beauty of the neighborhood planning images, but this is important to note. Like, we're doing this work, we're putting assumptions in, but this is an order of magnitude kind of discussion. Where you can see, again, normal distribution. Most of the buildings, these are the residential ones on the left, commercial on the right. Most of the buildings are of a similar shape or a similar square footage, but then you have a tail of smaller ones. But I'm not accounting for shading from one building to the next, the influence of trees, things like that are kind of outside of where that level of complexity is just not appropriate for what we're trying to do. But that's to give you a visual idea of what this actually is. Think of this as like dozens of energy models. And I'll point out that I say this is residential on the left, commercial on the right. I didn't actually combine things to make mixed use buildings to simplify the job for me, and also the energy story wouldn't be terrifically different if they were combined. So but again, that's an assumption. So go over quickly the tools that I used. Y'all are probably all familiar with a lot of them. There's Rhino is a tool to use to draw shapes, and it's draw stuff, 3D stuff. And the reason it's so great is that for me, as the energy guy, I'm not an architect, but I use the grasshopper tool, and I just use that to make these buildings, to figure out how to make a bunch of shapes of this size and make them follow the normal distribution. You know, it was incredibly helpful for that task. And then of course the further advantage is you can take all those 3D models and throw them into these energy tools, and it's literally called the zoo. If any of you have played with these tools before, you're familiar. Ladybug, honeybee, dragonfly, these things take shapes from Rhino and make energy models. And especially dragonfly is a tool for district scale stuff, urban scale stuff, that you can quickly set up floor plans and make reasonable assumptions without having to go in and model that for each individual building. And then finally, at the end, we leverage this thing called Urban Opt, which is built by the Renewable Energy Lab. And it's great because it can run a whole bunch of energy models at the same time and then collect all the data and lets you look at it. Like, you know, it's just a big job managing all these buildings. Usually we're talking about 1 or 2 buildings in a project. So we do all this work, we made all these assumptions, and then we have a result to investigate. So I'll highlight here first the oh, I gotta let this kitty out just a second. Go ahead. Okay. This is the basic graph of the neighborhood loads that we spent a lot of time looking at. So I'll take you all through it. So there's, you know, left to right is time of year. So I'm simulating this whole neighborhood's energy use over a year, a typical year. And then on the left is the energy consumption in megawatt hours. And by convention, we are saying that the heating energy is negative and the cooling is positive. And then further, we have this thing that we're calling shared energy. So that's times of the year where there's both heating and cooling going on. And that is one of the most interesting and exciting things that a district energy system is advertised as letting you do. Is like, if you have one building that needs heating and another that needs cooling, you can share that, you know, because what happens if a building needs cooling, just a little bit of physics for you all, that's actually moving heat out of a building. When we say cooling, we're actually moving heat out. And normally that heat just goes to like your outdoor unit in your air conditioner and just kind of goes out into the air. But in a district system, instead, we can put it in some kind of loop or water pipe or something and then share it with another building. So that's the gist of the idea of shared energy. And I've quantified here, okay, how much of the energy needed can be shared. And, you know, if you look, like on the left side, we have the low energy shape neighborhood, and then on the right side, we have the high energy shape. And both of them, there's some sharing going on, not a terribly different story, you know, which is interesting. We'll talk more about shared energy on the next slide. I'll highlight that, you know, the higher energy shape building, there's a lot, these spikes are higher. They are, there's more need for energy, which, okay, now we know. You know, we thought we weren't sure exactly if depending on where the neighborhood landed in the shape of the building, would that drastically change the energy profile? Not exactly. So that's good knowledge to have. And then there's one more chart here. I'll zoom in. We've got the it's called a load duration curve. So it's basically taking all the spikes from above and reordering them from highest to lowest. And what this lets you do is kind of compare you know, the peak energy needs of the neighborhood. That's a big part of thinking about a microgrid and thinking about resiliency is, okay, what is the peak that we have? So this is data that's really helpful for planners and just understanding the neighborhood. So You can see that the peaks are higher on the right. Zoom out. And than they are on the left, which high versus low energy, great. The shapes are fairly similar. Cooling peters off. It's only so much of the year there's even cooling happening. So that's an important thing to know, because that means if you're installing a big central chiller or something to make cold water, it's only going to run part of the year. Like that may not fit what we want or what we are willing to pay for and maintain. Anyway, this is how you use the data. So that's probably all to go over. So hopefully you're all still awake after that chart. And here's to kind of bring it home. Okay, shared energy. What are we talking about? What is a reference point? Well, we all were very inspired by what Stanford has. Stanford has this incredible campus energy plant, and they have done a study like what we've done and actually implemented a tremendous amount of amazing technology. And they have come up, when they were studying their own campus, they came up with the similar chart. I mean, I based my chart on what they did so we could understand the reference. And you can see in their chart, it's orange almost the whole year. I mean, something like 88% of their heating is matched to their cooling needs. So, okay, you can see why it was a slam dunk case for Stanford to go into this district energy business. But why is that? Why is it such a more compelling shared energy scenario with Stanford? Well, a couple of reasons. Their building stock, there's great big buildings, and a lot of them are old and possibly not very energy efficient. So they're using a lot of heating or a lot of cooling. They have some building types like hospitals and big laboratories that are big energy users. And so, it's just a very different neighborhood profile. Like this South Java neighborhood was our largest individual neighborhood of the whole constellation. And it still doesn't quite hold a candle. I don't even think I have the scale the same because they used MMBTU. But that's the story on why is it so different, and helps give a reference point for policymakers. Okay, how do we justify this choice? How do we compare it to similar projects? Here you go. So we were a little bit maybe disappointed that we couldn't have that much shared energy, and we thought we wanted to double check some assumptions. And one of the big ones was, what do we do with climate change? Like all the modeling that we did up to this point was using what we call typical weather, which is not worth going into, but the gist is it's weather picked out from conditions that happened in the last 30 years. We all know that weather is changing significantly while we're experiencing it in a big way this week. So we thought it would be really helpful and important to understand, how does the future weather influence this the district energy profile. So on the far left is the same chart you've seen. This is typical weather, and then we have two different future weather conditions. They're called shared socioeconomic pathways. If y'all have ever dug into some of the climate science data, you may be familiar. And we use some academic tools to make weather files that align to these two scenarios. So SSP1 is kind of like, I consider the good scenario, where the society pulls together as a globe, where we work hard to reduce emissions and we limit the temperature change. I don't remember the number, but it's like this is best case, this sort of most plausible, realistic, but optimistic scenario. And then on the far right is pathway 5, which is kind of like, well, we kind of don't really try very hard, and climate change just kind of continues somewhat unabated. And I'm oversimplifying the scenarios. If you work in this field, I'm sorry. Just so you know, this is sort of best case and worst case. And you do see big changes in the neighborhood profile. You see that the heating shape gets smaller and smaller, depending on how bad climate change gets, and the cooling goes up. Okay, so does that help us justify the district energy system? Do we have a lot more shared energy? Well, to an extent, we do. We see the heating goes from 9 to 16 to 20% shared. So that's improvement. And then, but the cooling actually goes down because so much of the future climate is these extremes, and the extremes don't really allow for great sharing because it's just like all heating one day or all cooling the next. So anyway, pretty fascinating. And this is something I'm sure many of you are working on, trying to understand how future weather affects the buildings you're designing. If this, as this is sort of a what the study we did is the what did you call it, the sort of proof of concept, or not even that, just a big picture early concept study. But of course, to design a real district system would require a much more detailed, involved study, and this would be a huge part of it. How do you decide how much capacity to build into your district system? Because how do you project where climate change is going to take you? And this is a big deal if you're centralizing all your energy production on one system. So, okay, we kind of ended up with we have a lot of heating and not a ton of cooling. And so there's the discussion of what kind of district system is appropriate. There's the two big types we discussed were kind of the old school two different loops, a hot water loop and a chilled water loop, or an ambient loop. Ambient loop is really attractive because it allows for lots of different users to add and remove energy, and you don't have to build central systems. So I'm kind of comparing the flipping back and forth here, but we wanted the ambient loop to be the most compelling option, but unfortunately, for the current status of how Moffett Park is projected, this sort of more traditional loop is the only one that makes sense. And the principal reason, or that makes the most sense, the principal reason is that those loads are just so imbalanced. There's so much more heating than there is cooling. With the traditional loop, you can still do some of the energy sharing. You get advantages of, if you're centralizing all your equipment, then you get a really high efficiency piece of equipment in the middle, and you have dedicated staff keeping it going. Whereas in typical, if every house has its own HVAC, then maybe it's not necessarily that well maintained or that optimized. So there are advantages here, but the disadvantage is you have multiple loops, and you're sort of tied to this technology. So the ambient loop would be more attractive because it's kind of more like a geothermal loop. If you're familiar, you're adding and removing energy from one big pipe, and you can make use of low temperature sources if you have you kind of need to have very hot water for a central boiler, or pretty hot, and that's kind of hard to make really hot water, especially with like a heat pump, which is a technology that we kind of want to use because it's electric. Whereas in this ambient loop, you could take use of heat pumps, smaller heat pumps, and that don't need a lot of heat to make them work. So take a break. You can take advantage really easily of any waste heat from like a data center. But if you only have one loop and you're adding heat and removing heat from that same loop, it needs to be in balance. And so the current scenario, it just doesn't quite work. So we were not daunted. We were thinking about how could we make this work? How could we make more shared energy happen? And so we came up with a few ideas to put in our report. We've got could we possibly pair with a large energy user, like a hospital or a data center? It feels like possibly appropriate for Silicon Valley, or some other industrial use, like some user that has a lot of cooling needs, basically. Or could we pair with Google? I mean, Google was a big part of the discussion and helped basically inspired the whole specific plan. And we had a really great discussion with folks from Google, and they are doing their own district system in this same neighborhood. And it seemed like, wow, this could really be a potential partnership. The unfortunate sticky detail is that if you start sharing energy from a private company to a public, some kind of public good, then you start to look like you're acting as a utility. And once the state thinks you're acting as a utility, regulation becomes very different. And definitely talking with the very nice folks at Google, this was something they were very aware of, and any partnership would need to somehow account for this. Another option that Bianca already mentioned is the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Community Choice Aggregator, coming together to bring different loads together that we could share with them. And they were very positive about this. But again, there's building a thermal system sort of utility would be new, and the regulation would be tough. So I promised we'd talk a little bit about microgrid, and the big picture of what this thermal system means for the grid is that the electric grid is that you're saving energy, you're saving heating, you're saving cooling, and so that means you're using less electric energy to make heating and cooling. And I just threw a chart up here for each neighborhood. You know, the traditional old school HVAC system, electric demand, if you're familiar with demand, it's measured in kilowatts or megawatts. And so I have the traditional one on the one column, and then district energy on the next, and then the savings. And so this is for the high energy shape. You've got something like 71 megawatts of savings. And so I'm not sure how that fits into the current grid, but from what Bianca shared, the existing grid in this area is already constrained. And so this is an opportunity to reduce the strain on that grid. And very, very compelling from an avoidance of capital cost, and helps to make any actual microgrid where you've got renewables of various flavors more easily swallowed. You don't have to provide quite as much energy in that microgrid. So that's just a flavor. You know, we wanted to do, I'm still working on some more detailed actual, like, what does the actual electric profile look like of this neighborhood if with a district system? You know, how can we compare to things like the duck curve, which all of you Californians know very well? Can we think about how to which district energy system is more appropriate to help with some of our grid challenges? So there you can take what I did and shove it into another tool called Modelica, and it's the scale of this project is so enormous, hundreds and hundreds of buildings, that it kind of broke the tool. The tool it's not exactly new, but this application is new. And usually you're talking about a little campus of like 10 buildings, but so doing 100, a whole bunch of new issues popped up. So this project is great because we are pushing the envelope of where the industry's at. We are really informing the tool makers on what, if we want to really get aggressive about climate change and achieve all these goals and resilience, like, these tools need to be able to handle it. So I'm still working on that. I'm optimistic I'll make some progress. So, and then finally, one last slide about how to do district energy. Bianca mentioned a big part of their scope is, well, how do you implement such a thing? Even if you choose to do a district energy for this gigantic neighborhood, well, where do you start? And there's some key pieces to keep in mind. You've got You have to think about how the whole neighborhood would fit together. You can't build a district system that's only big enough for this corner of the neighborhood, because the idea is that eventually everybody gets linked up. So you need to think about how big your piping is and how big your central systems are, before you, even if you're only going to build out a little bit at first, because it's very capital intensive. So that's just a big picture piece. If you're picking a small neighborhood, try to pick your initial neighborhood. Try to pick one where it'll work. The odds of success are high. Maybe it's serving some community amenity like a library or something. Um, and then finally, a big picture thing is all your buildings in this neighborhood need to be ready for district energy. So you need to pick what type of system you want, uh, whether it's this hot water pipe, chilled water pipe, or if it's an ambient loop. To make that decision early, and then you have to communicate that to everyone building in this neighborhood. So some serious planning to go through. So that's it. That is the whole spiel on Moffett Park. And it was just an absolute pleasure to work on this challenge. It's so cool. And I really appreciate Bianca's wisdom. So, questions, go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, I actually have one right off the bat. So what is the overall timing? It sounds like you're still in the midst of the project. What is the time frame, deliverables, phases, all of that?
Yeah, so the specific plan was passed in July of this past year. And we've currently are currently dealing with sort of like result of staffing changes and all the stuff that happens at the local government levels. So we're trying to push forward and are currently, waiting for review of the strategy from city staff. So hopefully sooner rather than later, but just understanding sometimes these things take a little while. So exact date TBD, but we are nearing the, we have, yeah, a lot of we kind of have the information that we have that we want to share with them, and we're just waiting for their feedback. And then, just for context, the plan itself is going to be, development over the next 40 years or so. So they'll be have to have some adjustments along the way, but hopefully the idea is that we can at least have, some things that need to, recommending some very near term sort of immediate recommendations, and also creating a framework for how city makers and decision makers can, begin to prioritize and plan for some of this infrastructure moving forward.
So a second thought that I had in your discussion about the low energy building versus the high energy building is to remove some of that uncertainty by formulating the parameters of the low energy building for the design team as part of the design for development for architects working in the plan. That will eventually be incorporated into the requirements if you can develop, sort of take out the top half of the high energy version and really hone in on what would make for a low energy or lower energy envelope or lower energy building form. That's the kind of feedback that could really have some effect on the shape of the plan from the planning
Yeah,
and urban design point of view.
that's a fantastic suggestion. I mean, I don't know, Bianca, I don't know if you can even comment. Like, is there room in the way the plan is written for um sort of saying things like, look, don't do not design a glass tower? Like, is there, I honestly, I don't know. The plan is enormous, and I only
Hmm.
I certainly can't comment, but maybe
I So just in regards to, can you rephrase the question?
Sure,
Well,
like, oh, go ahead, Ned.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are many phases, and there will be at least in terms of projects I've worked on in the past, there will be, urban design guidelines that will be written as part of the next phase, or maybe some phases for some pieces of it. And, you're talking about building form and how you can start to affect that to um, to encourage the outcomes you want in terms of the energy use.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I suppose, there's so I would say, I know just in terms of like zoning guidelines, that sort of thing that are in the plan, I believe the maximum height for buildings in the district is 6 stories. I could be wrong. But I guess there's then there's all the other, there's the district energy and energy piece and what creates a compelling energy argument. And then of course there's the actual all the other benefits that do come along with higher density units and some of the other district infrastructure elements that I mentioned, like robust transit and mobility and things like that
mhm,
work. So I think what we've tried to do as much as possible is to encourage, like Graham mentioned, for example, if there is to be a district energy system, how do we get buildings to be ready, to be district sort of ready or planned
mhm,
for that as they are constructed? So to the most that we could, we've tried to encourage that in the infrastructure strategy. But yeah, I guess just going back to um, weighing the benefits of a district system, and of course we want certain outcomes in that regard, but weighing it against also some of the other benefits that do come with maybe building types that aren't conducive to energy outcomes that we want.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension. Like, we have huge demand for more square footage and more housing units, and we also have this compromised grid, and we have climate goals. And like, okay, we're trying to like squeeze our new development into a certain shape, both literally and figuratively, I guess.
mhm,
So I don't know. I wonder if sort of maybe they're sort of relying on the building code process to kind of take care of some of that stuff. Like, oh, Title 24 in 10 years is going to be all everybody's living in 10% window wall ratio, and
mhm,
I that
yeah,
anyway, speculation.
mhm. So does anyone on the call want to pose a question? Anyone have questions for our panelists? I think we're okay. Well, there we have it.
Cool.
Well,
If
thank you
anyone
both.
feels, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, if anyone feels really strongly for some reason they want to read the whole specific plan, or at least take a look as to some of what Graham and I were mentioning, I just put a link in the chat. There is some really cool stuff in there. Obviously, it gets nitty gritty, but I do think it is a really, really cool opportunity, and sort of like, as I mentioned, and as Graham mentioned, kind of like breaking the tools that we have, because this scale of thinking is just really, really rare. So I think there's some cool stuff in there and cool opportunities.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Bianca. It didn't even occur to me, but yeah, it's like I don't know. Someone needs to do some literature review. Like, has anyone done this ambitious before?
Mhm.
Anyway. Uh,
Hey there, I just wanted to
hmm.
introduce myself, and Bianca and Graham, appreciated your presentation. And I work for the Army Corps of Engineers in San Francisco District. We're starting a project in Sunnyvale, and
Hmm.
in this area, actually, looking at coastal flood risk, or compound flood risk, and then also looking for opportunities to do ecosystem restoration along the shoreline and improve recreational access and opportunities. So it's a multi-purpose study. We are going to be working in the area for 3 years with the goal of developing a recommendation to Congress on how to move forward with infrastructural development. And it seems like we would really benefit from getting plugged in with the planning efforts y'all have been engaged with so far. And so I guess I'd love to connect with you both and include some of my team and kind of have a conversation around how do we envision long term together. So I'll just drop my email in the chat and
Great. And is that at all part of the One Shoreline initiative across Santa Clara County?
I think it is separate than One Shoreline's work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know that's going along there too, but I know, you know, there's a bunch of maps that I could have shown and some less related to energy, but I know there's the whole wetlands restoration effort going on. And yeah, so you're probably familiar with all of that, but yeah, would love to connect and learn more about your efforts in there.
Yeah. Sorry, just to clarify, it is called like the Shoreline Project. So we do have an active project there right now. It's referred to as Shoreline Phase 1 sometimes. We're in the 3rd phase. I think when you said One Shoreline, I thought of the nonprofit, or it's not a nonprofit, but the organization that's working up in San Mateo County, which is not involved with this project presently. But
correct. Yes, they're not. Yeah, they're not directly. Okay, got you.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks for speaking up.
For sure.
So good. If no one else wants to speak up, we'll let the presenters go. And thank you very much, Bianca and Graham, for sharing this project with us. And we'll look forward to watching it for the next 40 years. Like you said, it's going to be a long time. Project like that unfolds over a generation. So, and where we end up with it will be very different than where we are now. We know that. So, but thank you for peering into the future and doing this good work. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ned, and thank you, Sydney, and everybody for joining and it's really, you know, it's just fun to talk about. So
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. I'm going to terminate now, but we'll see you around. Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you.